Hello, everyone. We are going to start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to join the Ops area and Ops AWG meeting. Please note this session is being recorded. And the note well, please make sure you understand those important legal issues. Basically, all your contributions need to follow the IETF rules. And here are some tips. And firstly, please log in the online session and use Meet Echo to join the mic queue. And please wear your mask unless actively speaking. Here are some resources for IETF115. And let's go to the first session. Welcome to the Officer Working Group. It's chaired by Tianran and Joe and Hank. And before we really start, we need the Zulip scriber and the minutes taker.
I'm on Zulip. Hey, Rob, if you feel like helping with minutes, I'll help you. I'll try to. Okay.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, we can start. And here is the working group status. After IETF 114, the L2 NM model was published as the RFC 9291. And congratulations to the authors and the contributors. And there are 6 drafts submitted to ISG for publication. Anything to add?
Actually, question to, I think you, Rob, on, I got pinged on the TLS-TM, the SNMP transport model update. I just assumed that it's working through your queue for what will be sent upwards to the ISG.
Yes, I think I'm trying to think where I am with the docs. I think I'm currently reviewing the SBOM access one, I think. So I think that one is next on the list after that. So,
Thanks.
so it'd be after this ITF that I get to review it, but
Okay.
hopefully it shouldn't be that far.
Thanks.
Anything to add to the working group status?
Yeah. So there is a small addition to the draft from Michael. He was asking for working group last call, but we were missing some of the first early reviews there. I think we will go through them and then do working group last call on the Bible DNS and such later this year. But that's all.
On other drafts, so add encrypted DNS or ADD encrypted DNS. This is post, technically I need to close the last call on this. There was some additional, an additional draft of kind of a BIS to 4014 was added here. I was kind of hoping we'd get some more reviews of that. But I'm going to now talk to the DHC group because they've been heavily involved in this. To see if they might want to shepherd, someone there might want to shepherd this. But I think it's in a good place right now unless someone wants to state otherwise.
Great. Any question? You know, let's go to our agenda. We have a very full agenda. So the speakers, please control your time. And we go the first one, the mod update.
You have slides? That's not the right slides. Do you want me to do those ones?
No, this might be my fault. I put through what you, I thought I put through what you sent me.
I propose that they're both being uploaded. Well, you put the other one.
This is probably not what.
a new deck. I can just talk without slides. They're loading. I have two documents on MUD. One of them is MUD acceptable URLs. And the other one is about DNS considerations for MUD. The acceptable URLs has been through, I think is pretty non-controversial. It updates RFC 8520 because it changes some of the processing rules for at least one of the attributes in the MUD file. And there's a nice slide that explains it in one slide. And the document is essentially, it's been around for more than a year. It's had some various amounts of review, not a lot of deep review at this point, but is, as far as I'm concerned, is ready for working group last call. The other document is DNS considerations for MUD. And that has had a couple of, well, at least one fairly deep review from Ben Schwartz. And his opinion is that we're doing it all wrong. And specifically we, the internet, and we should be using SOX v5 so that we can see, so that firewalls can see the DNS requests, the URLs with the DNS name in them, and therefore can apply name-based filtering. And MUD is name-based filtering in the end. So I think that's an interesting suggestion. I don't have the power to make it so in this document. It would revise 8520 and, well, practically all the RFCs that we published in the past 10 years. So I don't think it's practical. And given that, I don't find it a very useful thing to tell us. So the biggest thing with the DNS situation is that we basically have to make sure that IoT devices don't bypass the local DNS. It's okay if they use DOH or DOT or whatever, DOQ, as long as they ask the same server that the MUD controller would ask. In the degenerate case of a home network with a single router, that means that essentially home devices should talk to the home router to ask for DNS questions. They should not talk to 8844 or anything else. And the home router enforcing the MUD should have a cache of DNS requests and should do that. And that's really the advice. It's as simple as that. Use local DNS. That's about it. And that document has had much more review and much more discussion, and is also, I think, ready for working group last call. Any questions? Sorry, I'll just run away and give you as much time as you like back. No? Anybody? Oh, Tiru?
Hi, Michael. I don't agree with Ben's comment that if you have to install root certificates on every IoT device, that's going to be quite intrusive. I think DNS filtering is the right way to do it. And we haven't figured out how to do root cert installation on home IoT devices. So it's pretty easy for us to filter DNS traffic. And we are already working on deploying encrypted DNS forwarders on home routers.
Yep.
So with DNR and DDR, it's pretty easy for endpoints to discover the encrypted DNS forwarders on home routers.
Right.
And home routers can enforce filtering based on the MUD policy. So it makes life a lot easier. And I don't think the proxy approach is deployable, at least in home routers.
Thanks. And I'll just say this, there's nothing against encrypted DNS. It's that right now, encrypted DNS is associated with offsite DNS, and there's no reason for that to be the case, except that that's how it's been deployed. So go do that from Firefox and Chrome and whatever to your heart's content, but don't have your IoT devices do that. Thanks.
So this is a comment from Hank as a chair. Was mentioning that one of the MUD-based IDs needed some early review. The DNS consideration one definitely is not the one. I think that has passed actually a lot of conversations. That's a timing thing. So without any dissent, we could go into a working group last call for that. The acceptable URLs was the one actually that I think needed.
It's less controversial.
yeah, but still, we can trigger this one and then go from there.
Okay, let's go to the next two IPFix related proposals.
Good morning, everybody. Next slide, please. So regarding the SRV6 SRH IPFix draft, we received various comments from Spring, OPSAWG, and also some network vendors which are working on implementation. We addressed all open issues and also verified with IANA how to manage the SRH Flex IPv6 and the SRH segment endpoint behavior registry. The outcome was instead of listing them directly in the document, we opted for having a reference instead to the segment routing header registry. We expanded the terminology section to have a consolidated view on the terms which we inherited from various RFCs. In the active segment IPv6 type, we added the segment routing policy as another protocol. And in the operational consideration sections, we're describing also now how to deal with if you have more than one segment routing header. We corrected the template and in the example section and added the implementation status section where we're describing the two implementation, one an open source and a closed source implementation, and also a data collection implementation. Sorry? Yeah, okay. Got it, sorry. So, and also a data collection implementation where we do the segment list section decomposition. Yes, Diego, you have a, oh, no, okay. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is the open source implementation in VPP I was mentioning too. We did tested that in the IETF hackathon last weekend. Next slide, please. So here, just to give context, so the SRH header part, that's the on the picture, the violet part. Basically, it complements the so-called provider data plane part where we can actually see to which PE which we are forwarding, and also the customer data plane part where we actually see the communication on the customer side. And here a note, it's important that the order matters since we have 2 times IPv6, and this is described in RFC 7011. Next slide, please. These are the fields which are in VPP now exposed. Next slide, please. This is the lab topology we used for the interoperability testing between Huawei and Cisco, where we have 2 Cisco PE devices and 6 Huawei PMPE devices. And we did interoperability testing. Next slide, please. These are the fields we are exposing in Huawei, and they are according to the A12 template record described in the document. Next slide, please. And here an example query then with the exposed data, so we can actually now select the traffic engineer path in the segment list section. We can see basically thanks to the segments left, basically the order of the forwarding throughout the core, and we can see on each segment left on basically which was the active segment we are forwarding next to. Next slide, please. So the open source running code has been published on GitHub. the first commercial implementation will be in Q1 and Q3 2023. And we are asking the working group whether they believe the document is in stable state so that we can request the early code point allocation. That would be it.
Next slide. Is there any comments?
Yes, specifically, Thomas, you and I, we emailed back and forth on that last point. How many people have read this document? I guess I could do a poll, but show of hands were few. It would be good to get, I'll ask this question officially on the list because I do want to follow up. You've done the implementation here in the hackathon, but we need some feedback from the working group as to whether or not they believe it's stable, and then we can go to the ADs and see if we can request that code point for you. So we'll do that in short order after 115.
Sure. Perfect. Thanks. Benoit?
Benoit Claes. So I think the IANA is one thing, right? By the way, we validated with IANA that they're fine with the latest version, which is actually 4. And actually the 3 is mentioned by Thomas. So from a process point of view, I'm not sure what else we could be doing to interrupt feedback from IANA, etc. So IANA early allocation is one thing, but you know, you can ask a question because it could go to last call directly. You know, we got feedback from the Spring Working Group, from everybody. I'm not sure what else we could be doing.
And we can put it up for last call as well.
Good. Thank you. Then on the second draft regarding the on-pass delay measurement in IPFix. Next slide, please. Here, just as a small refresher, IPFix currently is lacking the ability to export on-pass delay measured metrics. Next slide, please. And here, just to highlight the importance that not only we need to export the delay metrics itself, we also need to give those delay metrics context. We need to understand over which interfaces and nodes and also which forwarding paths, next hops and so on were being used. That gives us context in terms of delay. Next slide, please. So the current status, we received feedback in IETF114 regarding the terminology, in-band versus on-pass telemetry. So we adjusted that in the draft. And also we received from Tianran some feedback regarding the terminology using IOM, transient encapsulation node versus transient encapsulation node. Next slide, please. Do you still recognize the problem statement? We want to measure, a network operator want to measure delays. We want to do that at the highest scale to get at the statistical network delay view. The IPFix entities defined in the document are independent, how the delay is being measured in the network. And currently we have 2 vendors which are validating technical feasibilities, others showing interest, and at the next IETF hackathon, we will show also an implementation in FDI or VPP. That's all on that document. Any questions, remarks, comments?
How many people have read in the room? How many people have read this one? Oh, well, pretty much a good set. So we will conduct the call for adoption formally. I'll add that to the action item list after 115.
Okay.
See what the working group feels on the list. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
next one. Matt?
Yeah. So yeah, this draft, I did this draft when I was reviewing the draft from Thomas about this RV6 ETs. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the main issue here is that the IPFix registry is pointing to an old RFC, which is defined the TCBits that was already, I would say, deprecated by the IETF in other recent RFCs. So there's a deviation from the current IPFix registry versus the one which is maintained by TCP. So this is something which is really, I would say, problematic from the interoperability. And the other issue we have with that RFC is that the current wording in the draft about some of the reserved bits is that it is a little bit weak, and this is really problematic in case we have, for example, for the attack that are using some of the flag bits, and if you don't export what you are observing, there is a problem in analyzing the issues at the controller side. Next slide, please. So the fixes are really straightforward. Remove the any mention of the RFCs when we are defining the TCP control bits. Just point to the iterative registry for the TCP, and then we are done. So we simplify the way we are maintaining the IPFix themselves. And the other one is that for the behavior of the reserve bits is that the exporter must export what it is observing, and then apps to the when we analyze data to interpret it appropriately. Next slide, please. The next question is why we need an RFC for this, especially given that the IPFix registry is expert review. We can just go to the expert and say, yeah, please modify the registry, and then we are done. The problem is that in the RFC that are stated in the slide, we need an IETF consensus for this. So that's why we need again to go for another RFC if we want to fix what we have in the IPFix registry. Hence the next slide, in which I have, I would say, many questions for the working group. The first one is whether this is something that you think that we should solve that, or we just forget about it and leave people live with the interoperability problems. And then if we decide to proceed with this, we have some logistic aspects. The first one is in which stream. The previous one, I remember it was sponsored by Benoit at the time, and I don't know if we will consider that track this time. But my favorite option is to adopt it here in the OPSAWG working group rather than going for the ED sponsor, especially that we have already working on the other IPFix documents here in the OPSAWG working group. So that will be just straightforward. The other one, which track, whether we maintain it in the informational or go to the standard track. So that's open. The third one, either we just maintain the current approach we have in the draft, just with the old and the new, or we go to a clean version with a BIS version of the RFC, especially that the RFC is really a very brief one. So it may make sense to go with the BIS. And that's it for what I have to tell about this draft.
So I launched a poll to get everyone's interest. If there's three options here. You raise hand if you think this is a problem to be worked on specifically here. Don't raise your hand if you don't have an opinion, or do not raise hand if you think, no, this is not a problem to be worked on. There's no interest, or choose to do nothing if you don't have an opinion. As a chair, I would personally, and I know the ADs and I have gone back and forth on this, I would prefer to have things go through working group consensus and working group process. So I would like to see if the working group wants to take this on, I'd like to see it come or give the work group first right of refusal. And it looks like what you can see here, there is some interest in working on this in OPSAWG.
Benoit Claes. So you're right that first of all, an IPFix metering process must report what it sees, regardless of what we say in IANA. The TCP flags is a good example. Yes, it should be updated. Now there is another option, because actually when I reviewed what's happening in this IANA registry, we might have more occurrences than simply the TCP flags, where we were too strict in the description of what we put at that time of creating those information elements. They've been evolving. So sometimes they point to the right registry, description is wrong. So if we want to do a real good job, we should be reviewing all the descriptions there and making sure they point to the right registry. So it might not be just updating the TCP flags RFC. It might be, okay, if we want to solve this issue, and that's why I wanted to ask this question before you did the poll, Joe, because actually reviewing this registry for all the type of occurrences that you've got might be a good work to do, but tedious.
Sorry, hard to take notes and comment. That's it's a good question, and probably yes, something that needs review. I don't know, however, Med, if that's the work you want to take on as part of this work, though.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's something that, and I don't know. It could be that that's something that requires a set of drafts to go after each different area, or if it's something that someone wants to take on in one fell swoop. Rob?
So just to confirm what you said earlier, I have a strong preference to trying to get this sort of work to go through the working group. And that's just because of my workload. If it goes through AD sponsored, you get less consensus and less sort of review, and also it slows it down because of actually how much other work I have to do. So trying to get this through the working group is definitely best from my point of view.
I guess those were both Benoit. So it sounds like there is interest in working on this. I will, or we will, take this to the list and see about adoption. But to Benoit's point, this is something we'll have to talk about. Do we and get what the working group feels? Is this something that we need to do more broadly? And how should we approach that? For right now, I think we'll look at this work, this particular draft. But if there's a desire, and maybe Benoit has that desire, we can push forward with a broader look at the registries.
Benoit speaking. So Matt, why don't you spend the two of us half an hour to quickly go through the IANA registry and see how big of a problem it is. If it's only if it's only TCP, good. If there are some more, if there are 3, we could do it. If we speak about 25, that's a bigger job.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We do this week?
Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Benoit.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Thiru. I'm co-author of this draft. Next slide, please. What triggered this draft was comments raised during the ISEG review when we were publishing encrypted DNS results discovery. That was work from AD working group. At the time, there were various concerns raised with regard to discovering encrypted resolvers when endpoints end up attaching to networks which may not be the legitimate network that the end user believes it is attaching to these networks. And that's a typical problem today with regard to .NX not widely being deployed in several networks, endpoints not supporting, like IoT devices not supporting .NX. Evil twin is a very common attack that's seen in various networks because they all use pre-shared keys, and there are various ways pre-shared keys could be leaked to an attacker. It could happen in your home networks, hotels, coffee shops, even small office and home office networks. Now, how does that impact the work that was happening in AD working group was earlier there were several endpoints which were using trusted pre-configured resolvers like Cloudflare or Google. And with this, the the challenge or the security risk that was seen was endpoints end up connecting to attackers network emulating legitimate networks, and they would continue to use encrypted DNS, but the attacker who's hosting these networks would be able to see even modified DNS messages. So the purpose would be lost. That was the concern that was raised. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is the same problem in any network that use opportunistic wireless encryption, where there is no peer authentication happening. It could also happen in mobile networks where you're, as part of the supply chain attack, there is a possibility that the long-term secret that's stored on the SIM card is stolen, and you could be connecting to a fake base station, and the fake base station could be hosting an encrypted DNS resolver. Next slide. What did we do to solve the problem, right? We proposed a mechanism where we would use the discovered encrypted resolver as a fingerprint to decide whether you're indeed attaching to the same network or not, because these resolvers get PKI validated certificates, and that gives us, that means to say that the domain name that these resolvers are using acts as a fingerprint to identify if you're indeed attaching to the same SSID or not. But then if you really don't want to rely on SSID, because networks keep changing SSID, if there are networks which are using EAP-TLS, don't have to rely on trust on first use mechanisms. Next slide. So if you take scenarios like home network, which is using probably WPA2 or WPA3, which is using PSKs, and they don't want to migrate to EAP-TLS, then this is one proposal that you have, is use trust on first use. So the endpoint, when it connects to the network for the first time, fingerprints the network, basically takes the SSID hash of the preset secret to make sure the SSID is unique, because there is a possibility that multiple home networks could have the same SSID. Then use the discovery mechanism that's being used, either DNR or DDR, and the identity of the encrypted DNS resolver, which would be domain name in case of DNR, and if it's case of DDR, it's going to be a public IP address, which is be there in the certificate for the endpoint to validate. Next slide. Yeah, so once the client disconnects and reconnects to the network, all that the client has to do is recheck if the encrypted DNS server's identity continues to match. If it doesn't match, it gives a hint back to the client that it's most likely connecting to an evil twins network. There is a possibility that in certain networks, the SSID name would match the DNS server's subject alt name extension. So with that, what would happen is, for example, in case of a public Wi-Fi hotspots, you would have the SSID name matching what is the identity of the DNS server, and that avoids the endpoints to do tofu mechanism. But that may not be viable option for several reasons. For instance, my home network using a public resolver, and I can change my home network SSID for that to use the public resolver's SSID name, right? So that doesn't make sense in several other networks as well. Next slide. Yeah, what's the other alternative if you don't have to depend on tofu or get dependent onto the encrypted DNS resolvers? If you're using an EAP method for authentication, especially EAP-TLS, that's going to be a lot more easier. That all that the client has to do is check if the SSID name matches the SAN extension in the TLS certificate. This is going to be pretty useful for endpoints which are not managed by MDM, networks where client authentication is not required, and during the device registration process. The security threats that we anticipated was, hey, yes, the evil twin will not be able to see the DNS messages, but it will still be able to see the other traffic. But we see that the capability of the attacker will continue to decrease as more and more protocols adapt to use encryption. For instance, the work happening in TLS 1.3 and encrypted client hello. So the attacker will not be able to see the SNI, and they will not be able to remove the DNS records with ECH keys, and that will also give protection from pervasive monitoring, not to identify what target domain the client is reaching by just looking at the TLS traffic. Next slide. Yeah, we would like to have more discussion on this and any other mechanisms that would help to protect endpoints from connecting to these evil twin networks. Thank you.
Comments? Warren, I figured you might want to comment on this one. Oh.
Apparently, I'm really short. So I don't know if you saw the IETF welcome to the meeting message, but it had a whole thing on you might need to forget your IETF SSID. And that's because we're using .1x and it had like cached the certificate, and getting the phone to forget that was really hard, blah, 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 blah. I do think we need to be careful that if people do things like this, when their DNS servers change, that's easy for them to tell their device, yes, this is expected to be different. And yes, I know like the encrypted DNS stuff is all different. And sort of that's okay. Especially if the device is doing stuff like v6 multi-homing, you might be using one set of ISP at one point and another one, it might automatically change. So as long as it's easy that the user has a way, they don't get stuck locked into an encrypted DNS server that's no longer the one that they want to be handing out.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks.
Thanks, Tiro.
Okay, next, Benoit.
Okay, so on behalf of Diego and Nacho from Telefonica, from Thomas from Soscom, Jean and myself from Huawei, I want to present the data manifest for contextualized telemetry data. Next slide, please. So that's a document we've been presenting a couple of times. And I want to stress something, not sure if you've witnessed this, but there were multiple meetings and discussions about trying to keep the semantic in the IETF. So specific data collection. So we had a side meeting on getting Yang and Seaborg Kafka in order to do Yang push onboarding. There was also in NetConf a draft on getting the Yang module revision in the header in order to keep the semantic along the paths. It was presented also this Yang and Seaborg in IAPG. Nigel, who I saw earlier, presented like the limits of modeling. And we start to realize that we need to keep the semantic absolutely, not only in configuration, but also in the operational part. And this is all the topics that were discussed recently. Because the data without clear semantic, not only are repeat in config, but also in operational, is not useful. We are blind. We cannot take an action for closed loop action. So the end goal is to analyze the data from a data collection system with the proper context, the proper semantic. Why? Remember to do anomaly detection and closed loop. What we're doing with this draft is not to create new information. It's simply to collect the information we need to determine the semantic and send it along with the Yang push, the telemetry. And even if the source is not accessible, because yes, the information is somewhere, but just doing a poll on the router to understand this, maybe it's not the right thing, or maybe because the router was upgraded, or maybe because the telemetry information was changed. So we need this information. Next slide, please. If you know about this slide, about this draft, the example I always give is the same. Let's assume I'm in a time series database looking at a time series, and I've got one counter yesterday at time T1, and I've got nothing else since yesterday. So what's happening here? Is there something abnormal? Well, the first thing you could be thinking, if no telemetry data, there is a telemetry issue. Or maybe the router is overloaded and can't send information. Maybe it's a bug. Or maybe, well, there's no problem because you ask this information to be sent every single day, right? Or maybe you ask to do it on change. So if the value 42 in time series is still 42 in the router right now, well, you don't send anything, which is the same thing as the suppressed redundancy there. So depending on the context, you have or you don't have a problem to act upon. And this is the thing, whenever we go from the router to the collector, to Kafka, to a time series, to the analytics, and those guys in analytics, they're data scientists. I need to find an action there. So they can't go and call someone to say, how did you configure this telemetry? Because I only see a single value yesterday. This is what you want to solve. Next slide, please. So the proposal is to have two data manifest. One is the platform, all the information required to completely characterize the platform information, which platform it is, what is the OS, do you have a specific license on this, etc., etc. Because if it changes, well, the context changes and the closed loop action will be different. And the other one is the data collection manifest. How was the metering process? How was the telemetry configured on the device? This was the previous slide I showed, right? With a couple of different actions depending on the context. And this information must be streamed along with the source. It does not mean that we have to send every single time we send a telemetry message, but it means that we must be able to find back the information. So if the data is pushed to a different place, the context must be following. All right, next slide, please. So what is new in this draft? And by the way, if you want to get the details, there's backup slides. So we changed, there was a proposal to change the Yang module names to be more obvious. Okay, done. The prefixes are unchanged. Next, please. What is new, I would say, is that to make sure that we understand each other, we have a scenario in the appendix. So typically, you've got a device sending to a model-driven telemetry collector, sending to InfluxDB. So what you could be doing is at the top right-hand side, this is typically what you would be having as a time series in Influx. Okay, without a timestamp, because it's not useful to represent them here. And with the manifest, we have actually two different pointers that are going into, first of all, the platform manifest on the left. And then on the right, we have the subscription ID and the specific path that we're looking at. And they're going and pointing to the data collection manifest. So these are possible ways of storing information in InfluxDB. And we thought that giving a full example would help understanding what you want to do. Next slide, please. So I have to admit that we have not updated the draft as much as we wanted. So we still have some identified improvement that we want to do. One is to use the PAN, the private enterprise number from IANA to identify the vendors. The second one that Diego identified pretty early, this is data integrity and making sure that we know that the data is not changed, that the context information is not changed along the path. Dejan Bogdanovic last time gave us a good use case in the world of IoT, where we've got different devices, different IoT devices with different context and with different capabilities, so it's important. Something that we want to do is to properly specify the device, and that relates to the numerous inventory discussion we've been having recently. And regardless of how we do it, we need a unique ID, right? And that will be the one used as well in the platform manifest. So we have one extra question. By the way, the one at the bottom, should we include encoding? We said last time that we don't want to do that. It's not useful in the platform or the metering
the data collection manifest. So we've got one open question here, which is about the MDT subscription. So that's a collection of paths, right? So you could have one subscription with multi-paths that you observe, and somehow we could even have, I observed that path, part of that subscription, with those parameters. But the same path could be monitored in a different subscription with different parameters. Let's say one is unchanged, one is like regular pushing. And netconf allows to have XML filters as well. So in your Yang push. So that's one thing that we want to clarify on which key we want to use. So you can follow the open issues there on the link. So maybe the last slide, and I see people in the queue, that's good. So we had multiple presentation, multiple version, new draft thanks to feedback from Matt, Terian, Ignacio, and Joe. And that's a question to the chair. I believe you would like to get good option if you believe it's fine.
There's some, Alex, please.
Yes, things I agree with the problem statement. It's about what you're trying to solve. But one question that I have is in Yang push, you also include, well, the data model itself includes basically the subscription configuration, which basically includes a lot of the parameters that you have in your manifest. So hence the question is, what is the difference between what you're proposing here versus just subscribing to the subscription to the subscription notification? Doesn't this already give you much of what you need here?
That's a good point, Alex. So basically, you're right that if we have all information from the configure subscription ID, we have all information. The thing is that I'm trying to say is that whenever you move to time series analytics, if you lose that information, you lost the context. So if the device was still alive and pingable and reachable, we could directly go and get this information. So somehow you're right that we were sending the subscription ID information along with the data. Is this?
Yes. So I'm not quite sure. How do you? So no, I did not fully understand that. Basically, why is this different with a manifest? Because you can always, I mean, obviously, if you lose the information or as a client, that is always an issue. But it's irrespective of reporting it, because in this case, in both cases, you're streaming that information already. And of course, as a client, you would be expected to store that somehow.
We're streaming the data, but actually we're not streaming the subscription ID configuration parameters.
But you could subscribe to those as well.
Yes, we could, obviously, yes.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Good point.
Rob Wilson, Cisco, as a participant. So I'm just trying to understand what we have today and how this differs in terms of you can always, it's a simple question, but you can read Yang library off the device and know what's there. If the device is supporting Yang packages, you can do that. So you can get that information and embed it. Is the key difference here trying to embed that information into the data flow that's coming up, the streaming telemetry? Is that the key thing?
Yes.
And the second question related to that is, so today, obviously with Yang library, that tells you what the Yang models are and that information, but the other information you're including is a sort of information about the subscription parameters, how often you're polling, that sort of thing. That's to give the integrity of the data. Is that?
Yes, there are two parts. So it's not only about the Yang library, it's also the information on the platform, right? Let's assume that there is like a bug, and now you upgrade, you fix that bug, right? You want to get the information about the OS version, a simple example, to follow the information of the data, because in your time series database, you want to say, oh, this is before the bug and after the bug. So I want to learn my closed loop action after the bug, and the data before I can't be correlating any of those because the context, the platform information changed.
And so the key to this work is trying to identify what that context is and taking it off the device and holding references that to the actual time series database entries. So over time, you can see if the scheme has changed what it's referencing. Okay. Thank you.
Exactly, because we try to combine two different worlds, the world of networking and the world of data scientists. Data scientists, they've got no clue what we're doing, and in networking and configuration changes, and those two silo organizations don't speak to each other. So if we don't forward information along in this world of data scientists, they will be drawing the wrong conclusions.
And then, so my last comment is, I don't know if this is the right solution or not because I haven't looked at it closely enough. I do think this is a good problem to be working on. I do think it's something that it's helpful to solve.
Very good. Thank you.
Hi, this is Henk. No hats on. So with the huge domain of metadata, you're opening a whole new world to your manifest, and you're bringing a whole new world of telemetry to the silos. I understand that your silos are disconnected and you want to connect them. That's a nice goal. I actually support that. You were talking about platform and then integrity, but integrity then you reduce to how the data is conveyed. So platform integrity is this whole old can of worms. The metadata that you describe at the moment is just only static and dynamic nodes. It's just labeled data. So calling that a semantic is, you used it once in the slides often, and the ID it appears once. And that's okay, because that's just labeling. So my comment is, if you're going there, there will be a lot of extensions later. All of these extensions will be cross area. And I would prepare for that moment when people realize, okay, you're talking about platforms, but what about my platform attestation, my integrity, my keys, my trustworthiness, my intellectual security flows that all impact your metadata. So while you will create the first edge for siloing, there will be a lot more edges, I assume. So I just want to just carefully point out that this is an extension point you're creating here, and that will be used at some point, overused maybe. There must be a good gateway function, and that will also be probably has to be captured in the ID early on.
I would agree with that. Right now, we see a need for a couple of those metadata parameters or manifest. And I believe that we're going to require more and more of these if we really want to solve the closed loop, right? So I would agree with your statement.
Okay, then just check care that we involve other dealers, cross-pollinate via other places here in the IETF, and then maybe extend on that metadata scheme and really make sure that this metadata scheme is expecting all these extensions that might be incoming. That would be nice.
The last one.
Yeah, no, it's precisely regarding what Hank was mentioning. Just as Benoit said, is somehow my request to have some mentions to, well, integrity. I was talking about provenance when we started talking about it. And that includes timeliness and attestations and everything. We are starting to scratch the surface. I have been talking these days with Jean about some ideas on how we can do it in a compact enough way to deal with this manifest. But it's true that we are, at the first crack or something that probably is going to be some kind of a flood. Well, I consider myself an infectious agent when it comes to this. So I guess that we will be talking about this in both sides soon. I'm very much, I guess.
Thank you.
How many of you in this room has read this document? Please raise your hand. Oh, quite a many. Okay.
Hello, so I'm going to present you the draft about configuration tracing. So it's on behalf of the authors who are here. Next slide, please. So the issue is sometimes we might have a network with several layers of orchestrator, controllers, NEs. And if there is a configuration going wrong at some point, we might want to be able to trace where that configuration originates from. So for instance, a configuration in NE2 could be due to some service request in orchestrator A, and we want to be able to trace that back, because to know if there is where the mistakes come from, if there is a mistake in the service, for instance, or if you have like two controllers that are fighting over a device, they might overwrite each other. Or if you have conflicting intents, you can also have this issue that actually it would be the orchestrator in that case who are fighting each other, or just the services are not properly defined. So you might want to fix that. Of course, the goal of that is to be able to automatically resolve the issue. So we need to have a way that a software is able to capture and fix that. Next slide, please. So what we have at the moment in the devices is that we have the history and some metadata associated to each configuration change. So some configuration metadata. So the idea is that usually you have some kind of identifier that you can use to retrieve the time of configuration, which user did that, which protocol they used, and also the changes most of the time. So out of that, we abstract this into a local commit ID, which represents that single ID. But of course, since it's not standard, we cannot do much better than a string here to identify that particular configuration change. Next slide, please. So there was a draft from Jan Lindblad in the netconf4 group, which was kind of the trigger for this work. So the idea of this draft is quickly put that each time you configure something via netconf, both the client would push the configuration and the server would keep a common transaction ID that would be associated to certain nodes, and then the client, when he has to sync with the server or just change the configuration, can check whether the numbers, the transaction IDs that they share have changed or not. And if they have not changed, then you don't have to sync anything. Or you can do also configuring only if the key is still valid. So this is a way to speed up the synchronization. And in our case, we want to use that in order to see if the configuration that was pushed by a particular request from the client. So because we have this common ID on both the client and the server, we can, from the ID on the server, find back the corresponding transaction in the client. Next slide, please. So here there is some names. Actually, we might change that because we had some commands from MED to use parent transaction and child transaction. So I'm still going to use northbound and southbound here, but it's the same ID. So in the example here, the TX1 would be a southbound transaction for the orchestrator. And it would be a northbound transaction for the controller. And so the main idea of our draft is to map the local commit ID to the corresponding northbound and southbound transaction if they exist. So basically, in the controller, when I receive the configuration from TX1, it will change my local configuration. So I will have a local configuration ID. I will say this was called by orchestrator with TX1. So this is what you will remember. And in the controller, what you will do is that you will, and then you will store also associated to that local commit ID, the information that in turn it pushed TX2 and TX3. So this is basically what we want to solve, what we want to store in the Young model. So next slide, please. And so in the Young model, without surprises, we have the local configuration change, local commit ID as the key, and associated to it, the list of northbound transaction ID, no, the single transaction ID that caused this configuration, the ID of the client, and the list of southbound transaction ID. Next slide, please. So this is how we could exploit this Young model. So again, without any surprise, it starts by identifying where there was an issue in the NE. From that, we can retrieve the northbound transaction ID and the northbound client ID. And we can go back, then we know it's the controller, so we can go back to the controller. We can say what was the transaction for that particular transaction ID, and we can match then to the transaction ID between the controller and the orchestrator and find back the original service request. So since it's kind of recursive, there is no need to stop. Oh, okay, so last slide. No, not before to last. It's second to last slide. Sorry. So no. Yes, next slide. Yeah, thank you. Yes, perfect. So there are some questions for this draft. So first one is that there was a feature for the transaction ID. It was that the client could push the transaction ID and so decide what transaction to use, so that this could simplify a lot our process. So this was more a question for NetConf actually. So this is something that we would like to add back. So there is a question that we have to identify as well, is the risk of collision between southbound transaction IDs. So we were wondering whether this using only that for NetConf, because we have the transaction ID, is good, or whether we should also include RESTconf. So that's another point. I think we had some feedback from NetConf, which was, of course, if it works on NetConf, it should work with RESTconf as well. And finally, there is a draft that is solving the exact same problem from Jan and Rock, I think, where the ID to solve the problem is to use trace. So basically, you send the ID and then you push you follow the trace of that ID, but this ID is not linked to the transaction. And then the trace are sent to a collector which maintains the information of where each configuration went, which is another way to solve the same problem. So we will probably work together on that in order to find a common solution. Okay, last slide, please. So is it so thanks for the review, Ahmed. And is it a problem that we need to solve? And is our solution an approach that seems feasible? Jan, I think you have a question.
So Jan Lindblad, Cisco. Could you go back one slide, please?
And Jan, while you're doing that, I put a poll up on his question. Is this a problem to solve?
All right. Yeah, so I definitely support this problem space. As you understand, I've been involved with 2 drafts that are trying to work on this. So I definitely think this is important, especially if you want to take this network automation to the next level. We'll need this sort of thing. We get hierarchies of orchestrators and controllers, and this is becoming a more and more acute problem. We removed this possibility for clients to set the transaction ID in the transaction ID draft, because that was the common consensus or the common opinion in the NetConf working group at that time. I personally still think it's a very interesting thing to have there, and we can certainly discuss that. And maybe in the new light of all these other drafts that are coming into the NetConf working group, maybe they will change their mind there. When it comes to NetConf and RESTconf, yes, I definitely think we should include RESTconf in this as well. And talking about this last draft that is basically highly overlapping with this work, that solution would work pretty much the same for NetConf and RESTconf. So I think that's an advantage. And also that solution builds on the World Wide Web Consortium already established REST headers and stuff like that. So it's kind of nice to align with existing technology that's in the field already. But I would certainly be interested to continue to work together with you on this. And I think even though there's great overlap between this Rogaglia netconf trace context extension and what you have here, there are some areas that are not exactly the same and some functionality that's missing in one or the other. So maybe they could complement each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Robert and Cisco. So good to hear that you both sides are willing to work together on this problem. I think that's obviously the right thing to do if you can do that. In terms of where to do this work, I know it's sort of been presented both here and in NetConf, I think. So I wonder whether NetConf would be a good place to try and coordinate this, because that's also where the transaction ID draft is, and I think they're all closely related. So that would be my suggestion of the best place to discuss these.
I was going to say the same thing. I do have a comment, not as a chair though. So you talked about collision of transaction IDs, collision of client IDs, and I think client ID was brought up in the NetConf working group. It seems to me as an arbitrary string with no coordination, clients could pick the same ID. And then I wonder how volatile that data is, because if a device crashes and you want to see why it crashed, does your draft talk about persistence of that data?
No, yes, we didn't open that. It's, I would say, yet another inventory problem where you need to have a unique ID. I don't know how to solve that yet, except of saying that every client in the network should have a unique ID, and as you say, that is persistent. But I'm not sure whether it's really reasonable, considering that you might actually have orchestrators and controllers that don't belong to the same, are not managed by the same entities. So in that case, it becomes hard to solve that issue. So yes, I don't have a solution at this moment.
Rob and Cisco again. So in terms of conflicting client IDs, I think I would just push that into the space of whoever is sending those updates down to the device and say that they have to coordinate. So maybe give some advice on how they can achieve that. But I think keeping it like an open string is probably the right answer, and just saying, look, there are ways this can be avoided by putting like the name of the controller that's sending it down or something in the ID.
Okay.
As chair, it looked like there was good interest. 18 hands were raised, no hands were not raised. So there does seem to be support for this. But I do agree that I think NetConf might be a better area for some of this work.
Okay, thank you.
It's Camilo. Camilo will present. Yeah, it's the same presentation. I updated Hedgehog. You may.
Hello. So, in behalf of the authors for the draft data model for lifecycle management operation, I'm going to give a bit of update in the draft. My name is Camilo Cardona from NTT. Next, please. So Marisol already provided an overview of this draft in a couple of IETFs ago, so I'm just going to go very quickly. The idea of the draft is to, let's say, support the lifecycle management and operation of assets with a heavy scope on usability of the asset, that is, the features that the asset contain, the feature usage, and the licenses that support those features. This draft is not an inventory draft. We are, the idea is that we leverage other drafts that actually define the inventory. It seems like there are tons of drafts about that, and we need consensus on that, but we don't tackle that problem. Next, please. So the difference from the previous versions, I mean, the core of the draft is a young model. So we have been trying to gather use cases that basically try to bring that model to reality as much as we can. This is an ongoing work. So the more use cases we gather, the better. And we're trying to just to tune the model based on that. So we have been tuning the model a bit, and we're just on that process. Yeah, next, please. So with that, I'm just going to say a few words about, well, one of the scopes of the draft, which is licenses, feature, and feature usage. Licenses or features are complex to model, just as inventory is. So what we are going to try to do, or what we're trying to do, is to try to bound the scope of what the model can do or not, so we can present that to the group, and we all decide whether this is worthy or not, based on, of course, the limitations of a complex problem. However, this is ongoing work, but I do want to comment on a few points. Just to give you an update. First of all, licenses are features. The model will not model a catalog of them, but an inventory of them, inventory of features and licenses, not of inventory of assets. What is that? A catalog, that is, if a company wants to expose all the possibilities of features and licenses they have, that's an extremely complex problem. It involves a lot of graph and a lot of options, and that's not what we want to model right now. So we are not going to model that. It will be just inventory of feature and licenses. The second point is that licenses are going to be basically defined as feature, well, it will be an upper bound on feature usage. If a license is just a way of giving you permission to use a feature, then that's fine. It will just be a limit. Well, if it's just limited in time, then you just say it. But a lot of time licenses basically have upper bounds on usage, such as, okay, this can be used just in N CPUs, or this can be used with M users, or with X amount of flows, stuff like that. So we will define licenses as that, using the feature usage upper bound. Multiple times licenses have defined limit on multiple multiple properties. And we are fine with that as long as there's no correlation or relationship between them. So for instance, I'm going to read it because if not, I forget. If a license covers something like NCPUs, if you have more than 5 users, that's, let's say, kind of complex to model. We can, but then the model will be very complex. So we are not going to cover something like that. But we do cover stuff like, let's say you have an application, an app, a DB database that can be installed in many devices, but only up to N CPUs. That's something that we like to cover, right? So you can define this feature or this database is installed in these devices, and this is how many CPUs are being used for that database in total. And you have, of course, your limit on licenses. So that's our status right now. Next, please. So that's basically the overview. We have a bi-weekly call. Marisol coordinates that. So if anybody wants to join, please send us an email. Well, to Marisol or to any of the authors. We have some notes, I mean, if anybody wants to visit. This draft does depend a lot in the inventory definition, and that seems to be kind of, I mean, there are a lot of propositions for that. Actually, out of my head a bit how that's being handled, but it does depend on that. So, yeah, we would like to have some feedback on how that the inventory part will be steered in the working group to try to be able to scope better the draft, because it does depend a lot on the inventory management, on the inventory assets. That's it.
Real quick, we have people in the queue. There was a side meeting on inventory that happened here. It was shared on the list. I'm interested, and I think we have the multiple participants in the room, some feedback from that, because I'm very curious some of the questions you asked about how the authors of this work want to move forward. But Olga, I think, go ahead.
Hi, Olga. Hello, Jorge. I just have few comments about the draft. Like the first one would be
Close to the mic.
the first one would be LMO, like, you know, it is asset lifecycle management operation. So I personally find it a little bit kind of confusing to have lifecycle management operation because it doesn't define the scope. It could be confused with another things that have lifecycle management operation. The second comment would be, I think you lost one of the modules in your latest version, IETF LMO. It was there in version 5, but it disappeared in the latest version. So maybe just check that.
Which module?
IETF LMO. You have a common and you have the others, but the one in between was there in version 5. It's not here anymore. And another comment is about bidirectional associations. Maybe you can go through another review to see if all of them are necessary, you know, or if you could reduce the number of bidirectional associations there. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
This is Alex Clem. Yeah, I'm also a little bit, I'm not quite sure why this is a separate work from the inventory management and licensing. Some of the use cases that you show here appear to be things that you would mostly aggregate at the OSS level, so not on the individual device level. So I think clearly, basically, the licensing and about those types of considerations that you mentioned are certainly valid. But I'm wondering how much of that wouldn't most of this occur at the OSS level? Do you really need this instrumented in the network?
Well, this is not separate from the inventory. This highly depends on the inventory. This draft does not try to tackle inventory. That's a different story. So we are, hopefully, the inventory will be defined and modeled in another work. That's what we're saying. But we do depend on that a lot. That's the case.
Okay, but some of the use cases that you said really aggregate stuff across the network. You say, okay, basically I have a license, I want to have so many users, so many cores and so forth covered. That's basically what confuses me about that is this is stuff. Well, I think this is valid, but again, it would be something that you aggregate and consolidate at the operation support system level. At the management application or at the controller level, not really something that you would instrument as part of the devices. I guess that's a question that I have. Perhaps I'll just leave it as a question for now. But.
Yeah, that's a general question we have. Whether this information will be centralized, not on a central point, not maybe on the devices. That's a good question. I do not know.
Thanks.
So Rob Wilson, Cisco. I think this is like with the AD hat on. So you asked a question about how does this work progress and how does the work progress with the inventory models and things. So I was there in the side meeting. I know Chin's here as well, so he'll keep me honest. So I think it's quite right. So Chin's basically my summary of that is there's different groups interested in working on the inventory models, and I think there's interest in trying to sort of compare and contrast those and maybe bring those together. Those are currently in different working groups, so some effort needs to happen to coordinate those. I think the next step proposed for that is to create at least a mailing list to get those different parties together and talk together. We might need some more coordination across the different working groups in terms of that. I think sort of different from this model because I think this model is almost like a user of the inventory rather than directly having inventory embedded in it. So I think that's sort of interesting to decouple those possibly. And then the last comment, and this is more wider, I think we had sort of discussions about how these different Yang models are getting created in different working groups get work together and work as sort of like a cohesive set. And I think there's an idea potentially of trying to spin up a working group or a special interest group or something like that to try and coordinate not just specifically these sets of Yang models, but Yang more generally to see if we can get a sort of cohesive set. So that's a slight sort of side topic, but I don't know if Chin wants to speak any more about the meeting, but I will create the mailing list and we will go forward from that point of view.
Yeah. Yeah, just a quick response to the robot. Actually, yeah, we have a side meeting yesterday, and I think, really want to, in a high level, reach agreement for the terminology scope, and we think we can have a synergized effort to work on this. So we are actually request the AD to create a mailing list for this. Thank you.
Hi, this is Hank. No hats. Unfortunately, it was blocked at that site meeting yesterday, so I would have loved to attend that. Not having now read anything about the minutes or the notes about that, you're talking about licenses, and a lot of working groups, sorry, communities out there curate those lists. Especially in the software world, there's a list about 465 licenses. And then I see that you are talking about parameterizing those because number of users, which again would multiply the options how to represent licenses, and that's just for software. The OSS that was mentioned by Alex, and I might be confusing things, and that is my question. So why is the licensing here different, and why is the licensing here a simpler inventory solution than everywhere else? And I think that is something that was not standing out for me on the slides. And again, I apologize for not being able to attend the side meeting here.
I might not be able to answer the question directly because of defining licenses in general.
Yeah.
Here, we are, maybe it has another name, right? Maybe here what we're defining is licenses in terms of your ability of being able to run a feature or a product, a database. You have a license to run a database in a server, and how to define how much you can use that feature in terms of properties. So how many users can use the feature, not so much of licenses of software like MIT or not like that.
Yeah.
And it is indeed confusing to me because I cannot really define what the difference is and why it has the same word. So I won't be able to answer that because it's over my capabilities right now.
Overloaded, yes.
Yeah.
So that is exactly the thing, the scope that should be obvious, like at the start. What's the scope of the licensing so you're trying to manage here for the inventory? Because everybody else will jump on this.
Depending on their experience, that's what they will think. And to be honest with you, I was thinking maybe I should say this, but maybe I will get myself into trouble trying to describe this in the middle of the presentation, but it's very valid and it is definitely not what we're trying to cover, but something else. So we do need to be more clear about that, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very
that
different.
sounds that sounds very accurate. Well, this is Diego, the one that speaks after Hank normally, and just a reflection that is very much to support what Rob and Deng-Xin were mentioning, is that we are reaching the point in which we are touching. We're extending the idea of that we can read and modify the configuration of a device. And we are reaching the moment in which everything that has to do with the operational environment of the device, including entitlements and including the different modules to be available and the inventories, etc. And we are reaching the moment in which we are interacting with other kind of databases and other kind of data. I think it is worth considering precisely to start whatever, a group in which this is at least coordinated. So we are not having things that are happening in NetConf and then we realize here that anything else is going on, etc. So I believe it's very interesting and probably, I don't know if we are going to, I don't know, an interest group or a working group dedicated to, we should have to take a operational completeness or whatever. I don't know the name, but it would be quite interesting. And it's part, I believe, of the natural evolution of the maturity of the Yang approach for modeling and control.
So Robertson AD, so I think we'll create the mailing list and that'd be a good place to then have these sort of discussions to see if there's sort of interest and we can firm this up one way or another.
Bo from Huawei. I just have a clarification question on this because you define the asset. It doesn't specify the scope. it's only see there could be physical software virtual. So I'm not sure whether it contains all the like IT assets in the enterprise network.
How to define asset? At least we are considering the scope something that is not physical. So for instance, a VM can also be an asset. So there's software assets, but maybe I haven't thought how much to define it. So I cannot really tell you whether that's a yes or a no. But yeah, I guess the ability of a model to be able to also cover that it shows how good the model is. If we have more use cases, then we should be able to correlate what you say to see if the model covers it. So, but right now I do not know.
Marisol, in the interest of time, we're closing the queue, so please, these are great conversations to have on the list. Thank you, Camille.
Okay, next for.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Bo Wu, and I'm here present a network inventory model on behalf of my co-authors. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. The model, the problem this model is trying to solve is that in the current enterprise network, we have different domains like campus network. Currently, we have also like SD-WAN network to cover the WAN connection, and also there could be data center network or a cloud network. So each this network may have its own network inventory model to expose to the OSS system. But on the right, you can see the figure that we give here, enterprise network abstraction, network and security function abstraction here, that in order to do those like security policies to be consistent, and also the service as a whole policy could be consistent, we need like an end-to-end point of view to like collected all those inventory status to make it this policy could be consistent. The problem here, we try to like, we need to understand what the current status of network. So we think network inventory can help get this accurate status. Next slide, please. Here, I gave just some concrete example here. In our implementation, we see that there's more IoT terminals and OT sensors, Wi-Fi, bring your own devices, all those endpoints, they are moving in some different way. And we also have some remote worker endpoints that could be connected to the enterprise network. And also there could be some cloud network endpoints. So here next slide, please. Oh, I just recap what the problem is. We are thinking that we need a complete view of this network and its status. And we think the endpoints and network nodes are some places that we can get all those network information. And here I give some like network inventory documents that may be relevant. Like in this working group, we also have the service attachment points, but that I think that draft is mainly for the service provider domain. And also CCAM has that physical network inventory, but we think our work here is quite different from that one, because that inventory is just about from the hardware inventory view. And a previous slide presentation is about asset-centric, lifecycle management. So I think these works are quite relevant, but I think still there are some parts missing there. So next slide, please. So here in this, the inventory model that we presented here, we are suggesting we can augment current IETF network model that to adding software or hardware components to the current IETF network nodes, and also adding more information about IP address, MAC address, or some software information, and also endpoints information to the current network model. So in that way, we think in this way we can get a better network status from this model. So I think that is all about the model. So I'd like to hear if there are some comments on our proposal.
Rob Walton as AD. Only the same comment I made previously to coordinate with the other people doing the same sort of stuff and try and get to a common thing.
Okay.
Okay, next one, Chugang.
So, hello everyone. This is Qiu Fang from Huawei. So it's a 0.0 version of the draft, and the name is Policy-Based Network Access Control. So next slide, please. So for the problem statement, let's say that it's an enterprise network scenario where one of its employees, let's say he's a salesman, suppose that, and who needs to usually travel a lot from one branch to another and work in different branches. And such the mobile office will make his IP addresses change very frequently. But from the company's perspective, that such an employee has a quite stable role in the company and a unified permission control of the network resources. Let's say that, for example, the company would like to restrict his employee to access the YouTube for video entertainment during the work hours every workday. And the company would like to release that restriction during the work hours and weekends. So in this case, the controller needs to interact with the SL policy enforcement devices very frequently to modify the SL policies depending on the IP addresses and the time of the day. So we think that these different security policies need to be applied to, even it's a same user, but under different circumstances, it will be applied different policies. This also not only requires the frequent interaction between the controller and the policy enforcement devices, but also will consume a huge number of SL entries. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the question is, can we do better for this scenario? And our proposal, we would like to ensure the enforcement of access control policies based on a user group identity. For example, if we can define that as a user group of sales, then we can say that during the every work hour, every work day and every work day, he can deny that sales to the destination, and it gives a time of the day parameter. And then during the off hours and weekends, there is another policies without the non-work day parameter. And here I would like to mention that the user group, we could define it as an identity that represents the collective identity of a group of users, and also refers to the ones who access the enterprise network and consume specific network resources or services. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here is the YANG modules, which we call the UCL extension to the ACL module. And here we augmented the SL match container with a new choice named user control group. And inside the user control group, we have the source match and destination match. And inside each match, there could be the user group identity parameter, and also could define an IPv4 or IPv6 prefix. And also we augment the ACE for each SL, for each access control entry. We like to define a time range parameters to realize the time variant access policies, so that here we can cover the four types of access control: the group to the group access, and IP prefix to IP prefix access, and the group to IP prefix access, and also the IP prefix to group access. So next slide, please. And there is still another missing piece, because of the user group might be a quite abstract concept. It might be hard for the devices to understand that user group. So we still need some way to realize the group ID to address mapping. So here we just give at least two alternatives to realize that mapping. One is that suppose that the user needs to convey his username and password to the AAA client, who needs to, which sends the request to the AAA server and got the user group ID. Then the AAA client could maintain that mapping of the user group and his IP addresses. And if that AAA client also collates with the SL policy enforcement point, then he already got the mapping between the group ID and the IP address. So it's easy to act on the user group-based access control policy. And another way, another alternative, if we say that the AAA client is not correlate with the SLPP, then in this case, then AAA client could just report his mapping information to the controller, and then the SLPP could query that mapping information from the controller, and then got the mapping information to the action on the access control policies. So two alternatives to realize the group ID to address mapping. Yeah, so next slide, please. So I think that's it.
So Rob Wilton, Cisco, no hats. So the one thing I have concern here is the sort of time-based aspect of the configuration, and that's only because it feels like it's a very bespoke, specific solution to this particular thing. Whereas I wonder whether if we want to have time-based configuration, we'd want to solve that more generically and have a more generic solution for allowing configuration to change over time. Although I have to say, I'm not entirely sure whether pushing that down to the device makes sense, or whether it's better just to have the controller updating the configuration on time at various points of the day. So I know some of the other OSs do support time-based configuration changes. So that's my thought here.
Thank you. Thanks. Maybe we could consider that into the next version. Thank
you. Joe is chair. This was presented in NetMod yesterday. I think it was yesterday. And there was the chairs there gave us kind of first right of refusal. So I've got a poll here to see if there's interest in working on this problem. I promised Chin I'd read this, but in interest of time, I did. In interest of time, I do have some comments, but I will take them to the list, and I will relinquish my time to David.
I'm just curious, like in this scenario, accessing YouTube, you have user groups and IPs defined, but then your example, YouTube, was a domain. So the salesman going to different branch offices is going to query this domain and get different IPs. And so is this something that you're assuming some other system is tracking all the different IPs YouTube is on from different branch offices? Or I wasn't seeing how it covers the use case. So I was just curious how you were framing that problem.
My understanding, actually, this has been also discussed in the net model. So for your question, actually, one of the scenario, actually, you may have policy server. You need to plan your user group for different, for example, department, financial R&D department. So this can be installed in the policy server, and so this policy will be enforced on specific network device. So you can use this and to restrict access for specific user group. So yeah.
So I was more asking about domains, because you didn't define domains here, but the example was you're trying to restrict access to a domain, but there's no definition of a domain like youtube.com here. So how is that done here?
Yeah, I think you raised a very good question. So the idea is, really, borrow the concept for the attribute-based network access control. So we can add more attribute to cover your use cases. So yeah, that's currently what we thought. I think, yeah, could be a good point, actually. We can think about how to resolve this. Another, I want to respond to Robo. Yeah, this also be discussed in net model. So there's another proposal, ACL extension in net model. So for time related attributes could be, be generalized in the ACL extension model. So we can reference from there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Michael, please quickly go through.
So is there 3 minutes if we can keep it short? And then we actually are in the frame.
This is the right slides. So you've seen these documents a bunch of times over the maybe 2, 3, 5, 8, 12 years. Next slide. And we had a bunch of conversations. We tried to adopt some of them last year, and didn't really get adopted together. It was weird. So the major loudest suggestion from Carsten Vorman, and I'm not really sure if it was consensus in the end, was that the solution to the problem of these documents being not exactly standards truck and not exactly really being able to be IETF control was to extract the piece that required a standards track, which was the part that creates the registry, and put in a new document. And so there it is, Richardson OPSAWG BCAP link type. Next slide. It's a really boring document. It consists of the part on the right for about 12 pages. I talked to IANA about whether they'd like this in XML format, and they said, oh, yes, please. And that's really all it is. The important part on the left that you can see is that there is a IANA consideration specification requires first come, first served, and we have some numbers as private use. It's actually sometimes a 32-bit field, but there are implementations where it's a 16-bit field, like in NetBSD. So that's why we keep in that. But there are actually extra bits in most implementations if someone thinks that 65,000 is not enough for the end of the world. We're only at about 290 right now, okay? And that includes a whole generous amount of also private uses in the lower numbers, plus local uses and stuff. And then I would say over half of these are probably dead in various forms, but it's impossible to really know. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the short of it is, please adopt this document. The PCAP document, then we could publish it in any way we like, including ISE 80 sponsored through the working group. I recommend we publish it as historic. Okay. Yeah, there's lots and lots of use of it, but nobody should be writing new code against it. The PCAP NG, and gosh, I hate the word NG in everything, but that's where it is. We could publish it as informational. It potentially could have a 2.0 at some point. Or is that a 3.0? I don't know. Or we could do it as informational in the normal, not under control. And both will reference the PCAP link type for registration. And that's probably the last slide. Next slide. Yeah, and I just said that. Oh, and we had another document, already removed a bunch of stuff out of it that was like there's a system D block info, and I said all those things already. I think that's it.
So Robertson, so I think this is, I don't know what hat I've got this on. I think this is interesting work. I think it'd be nice for the IETF to publish this. So I think it's finding the right way to publish this. My preference would be try to get through a working group. That's always good for as an AD because it's less work. I'd rather this goes through the IETF than the ISE, but if that has to go through ISE, then fine. But yes, I think we should try and get this done because it's just helpful for the community. It's good to do.
I would rather just have this working group adopt or clearly adopt all three documents and then specify them. And I think we can move very quickly to working group last call.
That sounds good to me.
Welcome to the ops area portion of your program with your hosts, Warren Kumari and Rob Wilton. I will be taking minutes. Oh, sorry, the Lord Warren Kumari.
So just while Warren's setting up, I'll make some quick comments. Just to say that the Ops Directorate, we've had a few people that have dropped out of that. The Ops Directorate reviews are really helpful for Warren and I when we're overlaid with work because people's opinions and sort of comments on those documents help tell us whether we need to look at these documents closely and review them closely, or whether we can sort of say, no, actually, there aren't any ops area issues that we need to worry about this. So if there's people who've got experience and are willing to help join that directorate, that would be great. Really appreciate that. So it'd be really helpful. And then the other thing to point out is that the next non-com cycle is happening. And so again, we've got 3 people up for the ops AD role. And again, if you can provide comments back to non-com on the different candidates, that helps them a lot in terms of sort of choosing candidates. So please provide feedback if you can.
Yeah, what Rob said. Also, if somebody can let me share slides, that would be awesome. Yeah, Tianran, I think, has the current slide share. Not. Yes, the Ops Directorate stuff is incredibly helpful to us. It's also a nice, easy way to sort of get your feet wet with something that's sort of provides leadership type experience without the scariness. And is Tianran driving the slides, or am I driving the slides?
I guess you share as well.
Whichever people like. Okay. Okay. If you're sharing, you can do it. So I believe that this is being presented by Turnus, if Turnus is about.
All right, thank you. Just a quick reach out to the operator community coming from another area, routing. This is kind of, I take it on a draft that we have, but next slide. This is really going back to the fact that we did start a deterministic networking working group in the routing area to improve services in networks. And it started out really with use cases where a lot of operators and applications owners were coming in very early on. That took a couple of years. We got the problem statement, these use cases, which are a good subset of what we're now seeing, and the architecture, and then of course a humongous number of RFCs to actually specify the forwarding plane in networks. And then recently, this year, we started to figure out that we do see gaps in what we have achieved, primarily also to critical things that we were suggested not to do for the first few years, right? Up to now it was you should really only use in the forwarding plane what we have, because changing forwarding plane is always difficult. So, and that has been added as a potential option to the charter now. And one of the things that we primarily identify, next slide, is that oh, wait a second. No, there is one more slide of a summary for those of you who haven't been to DetNet more recently. So what DetNet does, in my view, right, is any subset of services for traffic for customers that guarantee bandwidth for flows, which is per flow setup by a controller, the maximum guaranteed end latency of traffic flows, which can leverage, you know, whatever QoS can support this at this point in time. That's one of the big gaps. It can only leverage technologies that are primarily driven from IEEE layer 2 TSN, and that's another of the big components, a reduction of loss in the network through use of routing for a diverse path, duplicating traffic and merging the duplicates on the receiver side, right? So these are kind of the three big building blocks: throughput, latency, and reduction of loss. And then, of course, all the components needed to operationalize that in the network, OAM, and the controller plane via Yang models for these services. Right, so now back to next slide. What I wanted to talk about. So where are these gaps? And obviously, you know, one way is to reflect it back to you, and that's really what I hope to do the outreach here for. When we started to look into it, and I'm going to go into more detail from the next slide, we felt that there was a lot of things that DetNet can do very nicely in the networks where people who came in had the background from, which is industrial networks, campus networks, where TSN is working, and where customers have just been asking, we don't only want to do layer 2 switching, we also want to have that working on IP. But ultimately, you know, when we looked into what are the forwarding planes we have, a lot of components we built are only available right now in MPLS in the data plane, and there has been much less resistance to even do small changes. So a good amount of what we want to achieve is not available on the IP forwarding plane. So that's one limit even for that. But the primary limit is that especially as vendors were looking at a lot of the design and thinking, this will not scale to large area networks, wide area networks and high-speed networks. Next slide. And so that's how we came together. Vendors and operators started to write problem statement, explain these problems. So from the vendor perspective, I'm working for Huawei. The cost of building routers that have these services at 100 gigabit or 400 gigabit for metropolitan access or larger networks is really one of the concerns where we feel that we need better scalable, cheaper to build hardware infrastructure. And then, of course, also the things where really the operators would have a lot more experience, which is what is the overall package that we need to build from DetNet so that this can be reasonably operationalized and sold, right? So we think we've seen in the last few years quite a few potentially really interesting high-value applications that could make, you know, DetNet the new VPN services, so to speak. I list them. I'm not going to enumerate them all. But then the question is always, what's the complete ecosystem? What are the kind of first services that US operators feel could help you to introduce DetNet type services? And then, you know, what are you missing to do that, right? And so that's basically the outreach, right? Come to DetNet. The problem statement, the requirement draft that we have, I think may be good document to start revisiting and add what's missing. Next slide. So what we currently have is key aspects such as reduction of the requirements for clock synchronization networks, whether to reduce the cost or completely eliminate that. That's been one of the core problems that we've seen coming from the TSN side. If you're in a RAN, you'll see that you have clock requirements in the front hall, but luckily not in the back hall, and expansion of that customers don't need. Support, of course, for wide area networks with large propagation of links. That is not supported by the current queuing mechanisms. Then, of course, the overall cost of doing things in a 400 gigabit router as opposed to 10 gigabit campus router. Large number of flows because you have many customers, the aggregation needed for that. And then, of course, also the operation of a large network, which has a lot more failures, interruptions, recoveries, also how to keep the service easily running across those. Then at the core of the latency, the better scalable, cheaper to implement queuing mechanisms, and the explicit path selection, where we have, of course, now since quite a while, the segment routing architecture with MPLS or SRv6 as one of the preferred mechanisms to do that in networks. That also given more view in DetNet so that we can well support them. And that list is even incomplete. Yeah, so I think we would really love to see, also an ability to prioritize these things based on what takes the longest to get done in terms of, anything that requires new hardware. I'd like to, if know that early on, whereas everything that we're missing in Yang models to operationally run things may be the most important to you, but given how, we may have the hardware dependency first, we can always, do that more timely then. Right, so that's a little bit kind of my overview on that. Next slide. Yep, and so that's what I was here for, right? So if you're thinking there could be as an operator of especially large scale network interest for you in DetNet, again, given that we have achieved a good round one and are now looking for things more for your type of networks, please come to DetNet, contact the authors or the DetNet mailing list. So I'd be really happy to see reinvigorated participation from you folks here. Thank you.
Great. Just to say thank you very much for coming and presenting. Appreciate it.
And we have about 4 minutes left, which I guess is the ops area open mic session. If anybody has any ops area open mic questions, statements, you wish to throw tomatoes and rocks at us, please do so now. No tomatoes? Looking forward to some vegetables. My breakfast. Okay, well, thank you everyone very much again. Also, another reminder, please join the Ops Directorate. It's actually quite interesting and incredibly helpful and useful. And also, please feel free to provide feedback to the NomCom. There is a large slate of people running. The NomCom feedback place I will put in the chat. Many candidates running, IAB, ISG, etc. Where did that window go? Thanks for Yep.